Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Umachandar. I'm a program manager in the Azure Data team. Today I'm going to talk to you about Azure Arc enabled data services. Please explore all the resources that SQL Pass has to offer. And also this year we'll be in the virtual booth. So please stop by for any questions, feedbacks, and thoughts. And lastly, yeah, after viewing the video, please remember to submit the session evaluation. So I worked in the SQL Server team for the last 16 years. I'm currently working on Azure Data Services. And before that, I worked on big data clusters and machine learning services. Okay, the topic is how to take your data hybrid with Azure Arc enabled data services. So I will cover the following areas. First, we'll do a quick introduction on Azure Arc. Then we'll drill down into Azure Arc Data Services and few key aspects of the data services. These are my session goals. So basically at the end of the session, you'll be able to answer the question like what is Azure Arc? And similarly, what is Azure Arc enabled data services? Then we'll also look at some new ways that administrators and developers can leverage the data services. Okay, so with that, let's get going. So before we look at Azure Arc, let's kind of look at the problem context, right? So today we have tens and thousands of applications which are running in very diverse infrastructure, right? So you have the applications deployed in data centers, in hosting environments, uh, they are deployed in cloud platforms. Many customers actually use a multitude of these environments. So now, if you have such a scenario and a setup, then there are several key questions that you may want to ask about this environment and your applications, right? So one of the question could be like, how do you govern and operate as if these resources are in a central place, right? And irrespective of where they are deployed and how you kind of manage it. So the other question is like, are there things like security, backup restore? Can you establish some policies and have them uniformly applied, whether the application is running in a data center or it's running in a Kubernetes environment? How do you achieve that, right? And the other aspect is bringing all the new innovations which are happening in the cloud platform to your developers so that they are more agile and they are able to respond to the new features and changes right quickly. And then there is also some requirements in terms of reporting, right? How do you provide reports and ensure that your applications are meeting your regulatory requirements and so on. So now this is where the Azure Arc comes into play, and we kind of achieve this by providing the Azure control plane over all of these resources. So this means you simply see these resources and services as just like any other PaaS service. So if you go to the portal, you will see a SQL Server instance, but it's actually deployed in a Kubernetes cluster. Similarly, you'll be able to see your Windows servers and your Linux servers. You can also see your SQL Server instances, which are running on-prem today, right? And same way you can see your Kubernetes clusters, right? So this is what Azure Arc is about. It's about bringing the Azure services and the management plane to any infrastructure. So this will allow you to run your data services anywhere and kind of manage them like a SQL resource in the cloud, right? This allows you to adopt many of the cloud practices, and this is something I will talk in detail when I talk about the data services. What are the kind of the configuration information, the security, like these features that we are bringing by default, right? So Azure Arc is essentially a set of technologies that extend the Azure control plane over to your infrastructure. So this is a way to bring the Azure experience to your data center, to your Kubernetes cluster, and even to another cloud platform. Okay, let's kind of look at how this plays out. So imagine you have, you have a customer, you're a customer, and basically you have different environments, right? So here you have your own infrastructure. You may have a Azure Stack or Azure Edge device, and you also deploy some applications in other cloud platforms. So now one of the things you can do if you have your own infrastructure is you can use your Azure Stack HCI, right? Similarly, if you are running on Azure Stack Hub, you can create VM for your compute requirements, and the same you can do on a cloud platform. So now one of the capabilities with the Azure Stack HCI is, it is reflected as a service, right, or a resource in Azure. So now on all of these VMs and the Azure Stack HCI, you can create additional servers, right? And you can create your SQL Server instances there. And now with Azure Arc, you can actually project these resources into the Azure portal. So you can simply see these SQL resources and your servers, which are on-prem or which are in a Azure Stack Hub device, or it's in the Google Cloud as another resource, right? And I mean, it just sits there with, say, maybe your Azure VM or your SQL database. So that's how the view looks. So it provides a unified view. Now, in the same infrastructure, imagine you have a Kubernetes cluster which you are creating in your data center, or you're using a managed Kubernetes platform in the cloud. So you can also connect the Kubernetes cluster to the Azure portal and the Azure control plane. So the same thing you can do on Azure Stack, where you have the AKS, the Azure Kubernetes service, right? So now this is where the data services come into play, and you can now create your SQL managed instances and the Postgres hyperscale instances on this Kubernetes cluster. And the way you create it is the same. It doesn't matter the platform underneath which the Kubernetes cluster is running. So this essentially now provides a way to leverage the Azure services on top against all of these resources. That means you can hook up Azure Active Directory and authenticate to your managed instance. You can authenticate to your Kubernetes cluster. So this provides a way for us to bring the security aspects. Similarly, backup policies. So you can establish a backup policy and push that over to your managed instances. You can initiate a restore operation from the portal, and it'll basically take place here. Similarly, you can do threat assessments. We have ways to do, security assessments. I mean, you can do that on your VM, your SQL Server instance, or your Azure data services. So essentially now you have the Azure control plane, which is kind of virtualizing or unifying these resources across these different infrastructures, and you can view them as if it was another resource in Azure, right? So this is what Azure Stack is about. Azure Arc is about, and now we'll do a quick demo on some of these capabilities. Okay, so what you see here is the Azure portal, and with the Azure Arc, you will now have these three resources. So first, maybe we'll start with the servers. So this is essentially, if I go and click here, This is your servers which you can register from your environment, right? As I said, like it can be any environment. It can be a VM, it can be a bare metal machine. It doesn't matter, and it can be both like Windows or Linux machines or operating systems. So now, once you've registered these resources using the Azure Arc capabilities, you would simply see these as another resource, and the way you identify it is by looking for this suffix here, which says dash Azure Arc, right? And then the resource name. So in this case, I have like 3, 4 machines here. One of that is actually offline. This is a VM. This is a Linux VM. You can also have your own tags, and here it's showing a tag like a data center tag, which is kind of pre-provided. Um, and there are other ways you can customize it. You can look at this resource and kind of see some basic properties like what is the operating system version and so on, right? And these properties change depending on the operating system and the resource. And this looks like any other, resource. Like it's part of a resource group here. You can have a location for it. You can attach it to a subscription and so on. And then there will be other capabilities you can enable on this, like run security assessments, right? So in this case, it's giving me actually a recommendation here saying, hey, you may want to actually install the log analytics agent so that we can take the logs from this machine and provide it in the portal so you can run your Kusto queries, right? Your unstructured queries. So this is how these servers look. And the same thing with SQL Server here. If I come here, you can kind of see like I have a bunch of SQL Server instances. This one is a SQL 16 version. This is a SQL 17 instance, and this one is a SQL Server 2019 instance, which you can see here, and its edition. And same thing here, you can do some security assessments. And we are basically adding and expanding the capabilities of this feature too. And then the last one is the Kubernetes clusters. Same deal, it's exactly like your servers or SQL servers, and you can basically do the same thing, and you will basically look at all these Kubernetes clusters. You can click on a Kubernetes cluster and see what are the properties of the Kubernetes cluster. So like for example, let me look at the one which I created. So here you can see some properties like Kubernetes version, the node count, and so on. So this is really the experience for Azure Arc, and when you go and create the resource, I'll do a simple one. I won't go through the full create. Let's go back here. Let's maybe try this one, servers, create. Okay, the portal is slow, so I'll skip this part. Okay, it's came back. Okay, so then you can do next server details. You provide some basic information. I will say okay, pick my subscription. You pick the region and the operating system. I'll pick Windows here. If you do next, what it's going to do is it's going to provide me this PowerShell script. I can take this PowerShell script, do the automation. It doesn't actually have the information about the server name and stuff. So it's a generic script which you can take and deploy as part of, say, provisioning of any of your SQL Server instances. And then once this runs, this is going to hook up the SQL Server instance to the portal. And then subsequently, you can just simply view them here, right? So this is like a quick tour of Azure Arc. Okay, so with that, the rest of the presentation, I will kind of focus on the Azure Arc enabled data services, right? So now we look at what are the data related capabilities that that you can take advantage of. So the first one, essentially we bring the data services from Azure to your environment, right? To your Kubernetes cluster. So one of the key principles is like basically how do you keep this always current, right? So this is one of the cloud innovations that we will kind of bring with the Azure Arc enabled data services. So so these are always in the latest version. It's like we call this like the evergreen SQL instance. So the updates are automated. The self-provisioning can happen in like seconds and minutes, depending on your environment. And this is something which you can take advantage of, right? Then what about like stuff like elastic scale? So the Postgres hyperscale can scale across different nodes and different instances. So you can run a distributed query. So this is something which will be there out of the box. You can actually add new instances very easily by just setting a parameter, and then you will get a new instance like almost in seconds, right? Similarly, you can scale up and down your resources. This is something Kubernetes provides as a platform, and you can leverage this very easily. Say you have some batch operation which wants to, get where you need like more memory. So during that operation, you can actually increase the memory for your SQL instance or a Postgres instance, and then the Kubernetes will actually find a place where the memory is available, and it will simply put the instance there. So this is a way to kind of automate even like resource management, right? And then the last one is like about unified management and security and so on. So this is about like bringing the Azure kind of experience, kind of the principles which we have in cloud in terms of security for SQL DB and SQL MI or Postgres hyperscale. So bring those over to your environment, right? And one of the other key aspects for the data services is we want this to work both in a connected and a disconnected environment. So meaning if you have a Kubernetes cluster which has access to Azure, then you kind of go through the same workflow which I showed earlier, right? And it just works. You can create a resource from say SQL Managed Instance from the portal, and it will show up in your Kubernetes cluster. Now imagine if you have a disconnected environment where you don't have access to Azure and actually you don't want to do that. Um, so maybe it's a very secure environment where you want to run your SQL instances. And we can still provide a way for you to upload that resource information from some other machine, right? And that and then the resource ultimately shows up in the portal, and it looks like any other SQL instance. So this is what the connected and the disconnected experience would look like, and it both of them in some levels would be kind of seamless. Okay, so now I'll kind of quickly walk through the capabilities of SQL Managed Instance, right? What is it? And I'll touch on only like few key areas, but the thing to remember is today in your infrastructure you can deploy a SQL Server instance, right? And with the SQL Server big data clusters, you can deploy SQL Server also in a Kubernetes environment. And similar to that, the SQL managed instance for Azure Arc will be deployed on top of Kubernetes, right? So this is all in your infrastructure. So that's what this table and this set of columns actually are saying. And then in Azure, you have the SQL managed instance. So now, one of the capabilities which we can provide in terms of scalability and HA, because we're running on top of Kubernetes, is basically the ability to scale the instance resources, right? So you need more CPU. So you can actually set a property, and it will quickly, basically Kubernetes will go and find the resource, and if it's available, it will go and create the instance there, right? or it will move the instance there. So this is one of the capabilities which we'll have out of the box, and that's what is kind of shown here. And obviously, this is limited by your infrastructure and your resources in the Kubernetes cluster. Same thing with HA. And then some of the other information, like for example, your hardware stack, your Kubernetes cluster. I mean, this is something you would manage and you would, support. But otherwise, in terms of capabilities, we want to kind of take the same principle. And one of the other key aspects, like I said, is today in the cloud for managed instance, the backup restore and upgrades and patching. So this is happening automatically, right? So we want to bring the same innovation, the same service over to your infrastructure. So when we run these managed instances in the Kubernetes cluster, they are kind of behaving like a managed instance in Azure. So yeah, so now Postgres hyperscale, the same thing. So you get basically your hyperscale server group in the Kubernetes cluster. You can add more instances. You can scale this based on your environment. We'll have the automatic upgrade, patching, backup restore. I mean, this is a platform capability we'll provide for any data service, right? And yeah, the rest of the mechanisms and the features are pretty much the same thing. So now let's take a look at high level, like what does it mean, right? If you're an administrator, oh, you must be wondering like, okay, what do I do with data services, or what are the new things I need to learn? So in terms of platform, like the data services deploys on top of a Kubernetes cluster. So you need a Kubernetes cluster to be able to, deploy and manage it. And that means some things like storage is managed more at a Kubernetes cluster level, and rather than managing at a instance level. But you can actually mix different storage devices and use it with your instances. So this is a Kubernetes platform capability, and this is all based on Linux. So deployment options. I will show this in a demo also. So you have a various CLI mechanisms. You can go create this from the portal and it will get deployed in the Kubernetes cluster. So we'll have wizards in the Azure Data Studio. The updates, as I said, like it's just rolled out automatically. There'll be a policy which you can set up, and based on the policy, the updates will be rolled out. Same with backups, right? So resource management, now you kind of do it at the Kubernetes cluster level, where you can set up limits. Um, you can enforce policies like, hey, a particular SQL instance cannot, get more than say 16 CPUs on this node or something. You can restrict the max memory that a particular instance can take, and this is without actually changing the instance properties itself. Similarly, you can provision certain nodes with GPU, and you can run your SQL ML, workloads there. And then, yeah, last but not the least, like some of the HA capabilities are built into Kubernetes, and that's also available. Okay, so that's like a quick thing on like what, as an administrator, you can expect out of the platform. So now, what about developers? So again, you get your database instances. This is your familiar SQL Server. It's your Postgres, which is running on Linux. So you don't need to do anything special. Use the same tools. I mean, the applications connect the same way. There's no difference, right? So in terms of development and test practices, we'll have some new experiences, and that's something I will show in a bit. Uh, so you can basically come up with some new ideas on how to use this, right? This is a new platform, new way to deploy your instances and manage them like any other application code, right? So this is also something I will demo. So once you've installed data services, what you get out of the box is essentially uh, the ones on the left side, this is basically our control plane, right? So this icon represents our data controller, which essentially manages the entire data services. And as part of that, we provide you with the built-in metrics and logs UI. So this is one of the interface which we'll have out of the box. And your SQL and PG instances have the usual TDS and TCP endpoints. So your applications just connect to it. And this is something which is abstracted in Kubernetes using services. So, I mean, it has a port and it's got an endpoint, a DNS name or IP address, and your apps simply connect to it. Okay, so now let's take a quick look at what data services is. So the first thing I will show is, so here I have VS Code, and this is the Kubernetes extension in VS Code. So I have many Kubernetes clusters, registered here. And so I have a Kubernetes cluster where I have about 10 nodes, right? These machines here. And what I've done is I've kind of deployed the Azure Arc data services here, and that's what is shown here. So these are all the pods which comprise the data service installation, right? Um, so most of these are the control plane related pods, like all of these control, bootstrapper, and so on. And then down here I have my PG and PostgreSQL and SQL instances, right? So that's what you see here. Uh, so this is a Kubernetes view of the instances and your data controller and other related services which are deployed, right? Now for an application, if you are in Azure Data Studio, I mean, you just connect your Postgres instance, you connect your, you know, SQL instances, and you just manage them like a regular, SQL or a Postgres instance. Same with if you are an SSMS, I mean, you can register that and just simply use it, right? Um, Now, let me go here to the portal and my browser rather and show the graphics, Grafana UI. So here you have the Grafana portal. So this is what I was telling in terms of the metrics UI. So this is once you deploy data services for every installation of a data service, you get this endpoint out of the box. It's pre-configured to gather metrics from your SQL instances or your Postgres instances. I'm showing the SQL managed instance metrics in this case, which is shown here, but you can actually click you know the Postgres one. And yeah, so you can see your Postgres instances, how they are doing, what usage of each instances, right? Your memory. In this case, we have some information about the amount of data which is being returned, and so on. So this is an experience which we'll have out of the box. You don't need to do anything special. This is your usual information from your DMVs, perf counters. So this is like your metrics UI. So this is something you will have. And then similarly, we have an Elasticsearch based UI. This is Kibana, and here you can run your unstructured queries. And this is again basically out of the box. We are collecting essentially log information from your Postgres instances, SQL instances, and then putting them in Elasticsearch so you can actually run these queries. So this is like a quick tour on what you can expect out of the box once you've installed the data services. Okay, so with that, now that was an overview of Azure Arc and Azure Arc data services. So now we'll drill down into the deployment aspects, and then at the end of this deployment section, I will actually demo some ways to deploy data services. So first thing is security. I mean, this is obviously the top of mind for every customer, right? Um, so in terms of the containers, yeah, we have all of these hosted in the Microsoft container registry. So that's something which is just a standard business practice. Then in terms of the default configuration, this is fundamental principle for SQL Server, as you guys know. And it's the same thing here. So in the Kubernetes environment, we'll run these containers in non-root mode and non-privileged containers. And we're going to enable features like encryption at rest by default wherever possible, right? And the connections will also be encrypted. So that means we can provide a cert out of the box for your TDS endpoint. Similarly, your HTTPS endpoints would be automatically, provisioned. So this is like part of the default configuration. There are certain features which we have which require slightly higher privilege. I showed the Grafana UI earlier, right? And there you were seeing metrics from the instances or the services, right? In some cases, maybe you want to see a next level down, which is your Kubernetes node itself. How's the node doing, right? Because you could have other Kubernetes pods and applications running on the node. So that's something you could optionally enable, and in which case from that UI you can drill down into the node where the instance is running and see resource information. So now then the other one is isolation of resources. I mean, today if you want to separate say two SQL instances, you can either put them on say VMs in the same physical server, or you can deploy them in their own servers, right? Or you can actually install named instances on a single server and manage them. So in Kubernetes land, you would kind of use namespaces, and this is one way to isolate resources. I will also show some examples of those. And then there are ways to target like pods to specific nodes. So if you have some nodes which have GPU in them, you can deploy say a SQL instance with ML capabilities in there. So encryption at rest. So what are we doing here? For the Kubernetes platform itself, this is owned by you. I mean, these are some things you could leverage, like the HCD encryption and volume encryption. So this is something you would do at your end. For the data controller itself, we will enable the TDE by default for the controller database. For InfluxDB and ElasticScale, they don't have a TDE mechanism. So in this case, you would provide a volume which has volume encryption. For managed instance, similar to SQL DB and SQL MI, we will enable TDE by default for the databases. We will provide the certificate for that. It will be managed by the system. Optionally, you can bring in your own certificate and keys, and then you can leverage all the other SQL features like usual. For Postgres hyperscale, Postgres doesn't support TDE today, so in that case, you will leverage something like a volume encryption if you want to, have the data at rest. I mean, encryption of the data at rest. So this kind of like some of the security best practices from the cloud, which we'll bring out of the box for your environment. Now, what about authentication, right? How you connect to these services. So basic auth will be there by default. I mean, this is something which is available in the public preview today. We are working on enabling Azure Active Directory for your SQL Managed Instance or your Postgres hyperscale instances. And this will work in the connected mode only because we need to reach to Azure Active Directory, right, to authenticate the principals. So this is something we planned. And the last one is Active Directory. I mean, this is something SQL Server supports today, and Postgres also supports. So this is the other one we're looking at is like enabling Active Directory in the Kubernetes environment, and this is something you can take advantage of. So now with that, let's maybe take a quick look at how with this environment with Kubernetes, you can use data services, right, in different scenarios. So imagine you have a development team or where they want to, have their own instances for dev test purpose, right? So one of the ways you can leverage this deployment model is to create a namespace, right? So that's what is shown here. So this is your Kubernetes cluster. I've created a namespace called arc dev, and now you can basically make your development team basically the administrators of this namespace, and then they can go and create the data services there, right? So this is a very like typical way in which services are managed in Kubernetes. So this is like you have your own, Windows server or Linux server where you're installing SQL instances today. So similar mechanism. So this is one pattern which your Kubernetes administrator can establish, right? So they can own the cluster resources. They will be like the administrators of the cluster itself, but they can make somebody like a namespace admin, and then they get to only work within that namespace. So the other scenario is, say you have multiple teams sharing a same Kubernetes cluster, and maybe there is one central, admin persona. And in this case, what you can do is you can create a namespace where you deploy the controller, and essentially your control plane is sitting in that namespace. And from that namespace, you can now manage different namespaces from a, data controller point of view. So you can still give each of your team, in this case like a finance team and a sales team, their own namespaces. Their SQL instances are isolated. Like the SQL instance here cannot, look at the data here by default, and so on, right? So this is one way you would leverage the Kubernetes capabilities to deploy data services, to deploy SQL instances, isolate them, right? Provide different resources. Maybe for a dev resource, you will just give less CPU and memory, right? For your production instances, based on the application, you can actually adjust it dynamically. So this is one setup. And then the last one is the every team has its own set of namespaces, and it's fully segregated, right? And this is basically the last capability. So this is just a way for you to manage the resources in your Kubernetes cluster, to manage access to the services, and also this provides a way for the Kubernetes administrator to delegate responsibilities, right? So okay. So with that, let's go and look at what are all the different ways to deploy data services. So the first thing I'm going to do is, so here I have Azure Data Services, sorry, Azure Data Studio, I mean, and this is the RC1 stable build. So what you can do now is come here and do this new deployment. I mean, if you have used this before, I mean, we've already had it with like to create SQL, big data cluster, and so on. So now you will see a new, option here, which is for the data controller and the Azure SQL Managed Instance and your Postgres instances. So first what I will do is I'll walk through how a data controller creation looks like. So the first thing it's going to do is it's going to find the Kubernetes config file. So remember the VS Code extension where I showed you all my Kubernetes clusters. So that's what this one has picked. So I come here and you go to the Kubernetes cluster where you want to create the data controller. So in this case, I pick this one. That's my default, right? So then next step is you pick a profile. The profile is essentially a template or a way for you to deploy into different environments. Like some of the names, like so for example, if you want to deploy in OpenShift in Azure, you would pick this option, and there will be some defaults which are set up, so it works out of the box. Similarly, you can pick OpenShift for your on-prem environment. Many of the differences is mainly in terms of the service type which needs to be used, the storage options, and so on. So in this case, I'll pick a kubeadm because that's my Kubernetes cluster flavor. And then now here you will see the experience is like your Azure experience, right? So again, this is even if it's a disconnected environment, you can kind of provide this information. And the information like subscription is used for billing purposes, and the resource group is where this resource will show up in Azure, right? And then yeah, so that's it. So I give a name. Uh, the name here, which is shown here for the data controller, that's where the data controller pods will land. This name is the name of the data controller itself. And you can pick the storage options, and this again depends based on your Kubernetes environment. And then you would pick a location where you want there is a resource to appear in the portal, and that's it. So you give the password. As I said, we have basic auth today. You give the admin password, and then it has some basic, summary information at the end. And then you can click deploy or script. I've already deployed the data controller, so I will not do it now. Uh, but you can see here, this is just a standard notebook. This is something you can take and automate if you want. And this has the input which you already went through in the wizard, and they're all provisioned here. You can see how it's actually going to deploy, and that's pretty much it. So this actually uses the AZ data commands to create the instance. So this is a way for you to um, you know create a data controller. Now let's go and see how you want to create a managed instance. So again, I come here, I pick the option here which says Azure SQL Managed Instance, Azure Arc, right? And in this case, I mean, there is a simple EULA here which you need to click yes. And one of the things I forgot to mention here is we also make some checks against like tools and stuff like that which are installed. So this will also be automatically provisioned by the Azure Data Studio if it's missing. So I pick the SQL instance. It shows the data controller, meaning that's the controller which is going to own the instance, which is going to manage the instance, right? Again, one of the other principles here is like the well-known, super user account names, they're all disabled by default. So we disable the SA account by default. This is something we did in BDC also, and same principle here. So you need to provide a sysadmin login and password, right? So that is what I'm providing here. So I basically give the password and a name for the sysadmin login. And then here you have same for SQL Server. You can pick a storage class for your data and another for your logs. Again, this is not to be confused with your transaction logs. This is like the log output, like error logs, SQL agent logs, and so on. And then now here is the interesting thing. So in my Kubernetes cluster, everything is deployed on machines with 8 CPUs. So I can actually say, hey, I want the SQL instance to get 4 cores by default, and I don't want it to use more than 4. So 2 cores, and I don't want it to use more than 4 cores, right? And then similarly, you can set limits on memory and how much memory you need by default. So I'll just say like something like 8 and I'll say like 16, right? And that's it. These are the basic parameters. And you click deploy. And now what it's going to do is it's actually running through the thing. So I'll come here and let's actually watch what's going to happen, right? So you're going to see this instance here, see the name SQL instance one. So it's now started creating the SQL instance. It's found a node where, so basically Kubernetes, if I go here and do the wide option, Kubernetes has found a node where it has this resource. I mean, here I don't have that many applications deployed, but it's going to distribute the workload, right? As you can see, some of these pods are running on different machines. So it picked this Kubernetes node and it's deploying the SQL instance. And yeah, so once it's deployed, I mean, it takes about 2 to 3 minutes, 2 minutes to create it. So this is what it's doing. So in this case, we are running the AZ data SQL MI create mechanism, right? So now you can see there are like two pods, I mean, two containers running, and the third container is the SQL container. So that's getting provision, and once that's provision, it's your SQL Server instance will be up and running. So this is how you create the SQL instance. Now let me quickly walk through the Postgres SQL, same experience. So you pick the Postgres option, and in this case you can do the hyperscale install, so which is basically the number of you can increase the number of instances which you want, right? um, so I will say here like maybe I need like 5 instances, right? Actually let's do 4, and you pick the version of Postgres you want, and the rest of the parameters will be identical. We also have backup here. This is something we added to the SQL Managed Instance too. Uh, it's not yet exposed in the UI. And same deal. I pick the storage I want. I pick the storage class for the backups, logs, and same deal here. So what I can do is again set the limits, uh, right? Something like this, and deploy. Done. So now if I go back here, the SQL instance is actually done. So you should, if I come here, yeah. So it says here successfully created, right? And I come here. So this one is running, and yeah. So it's going on. So now this is a way to use the wizards, right? So now one of the other capabilities which I'm kind of excited about, um, and I'm sure you can think of some new ways to use this capability, right? So this is about using the GitOps workflow, right? So imagine you want to treat your instances and even managing your Kubernetes cluster like code, right? So that means you want to audit who's doing it, you want to review the changes happening, and so on. So in this case, what you will do is you start with the Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes cluster, right? So remember the Kubernetes clusters I showed in the portal. So they are enabled by running this AZ command. I mean, since I've already done that, I will not run that piece of the command, so I'll just skip that. Uh, so now what the GitOps one enables you to do is let's come and create this, um, and I will start explaining what it means. So what this does is it installs this Flux operator on your Kubernetes cluster, and to it you can provide a Git repo to monitor. So what this operator, this is again running in your Kubernetes cluster, right? What it's going to do is look for any files which are there here, YAML files, and it's going to take them and apply those changes to your Kubernetes cluster, right? So I've now created it, right? Um, they're already running. So let's see. So now if I go to the browser, yep, actually that thing is already done. Wow. So what it's done is it's taken the SQL instance which I've deployed here, I mean which I've created here, the definition of it rather, right? Um, Let me increase the font a bit. So here I have this is a Kubernetes YAML file for the resource. So just like what you saw in the UI, right? So I'm creating a SQL managed instance. I provide a name of the SQL managed instance and same parameters. No? And what the Flux operator, once it's connected, it's doing is it's taken that YAML automatically and it's actually applied it to the Kubernetes cluster. And while these things are going on, I mean, you can deploy this, right? So as you can see, Kubernetes found a node with some resources and it's gone and deployed the instance. So you didn't actually have to do anything. I mean, it's you simply imagine you check in a change into your Git repo and that's it. So now the SQL instance is already running, right? And so this is one way where you kind of hook up your Git repo. In this case, I basically said, okay, here is a config information for a Git repo that I want the Flux operator to monitor, and that's it. It's going to keep polling. I mean, in this case, I set it to 1 minute, and you go and create a say new PG instance or a new SQL instance or even a data controller. So this operator is going to take that and apply it, right? Uh, so you can deploy any of the services which you saw using just code, using YAML files, right? Uh, so this is a way to leverage the new capabilities, and now all the instances are up and running. So they're all provisioned at this point. So this is one new way by which, because we are running on this platform, Azure Arc provides many of these capabilities, and Kubernetes also provides the platform underneath to do this kind of dynamic ways. Okay, so this was like a quick tour on the deployment, right? Uh, One is kind of go through the UI, go through the wizards, and create your SQL instances. Then you can either get your notebooks and automate them, uh, which is using the AZ data CLI, or you can go through an automated way of using this GitOps workflow, right? And you can also deploy SQL instances using just Kubernetes YAML files or Kubernetes tools, right? So that's what is shown here. Uh, I'll not walk through it, but in that example, similar to the GitOps thing, you will create a YAML file like this, and you can just simply apply the YAML file to your Kubernetes cluster, and done. That's going to create your SQL instance. Okay. So with that, now let's go and take a quick look at the HA capabilities, right? So there are two levels of HA we'll provide. One is the standard HA, and the other one is the premium HA, right? So the standard HA is what Kubernetes provides by default. Um, so in this case, like if a pod fails or the machine, where the SQL instance is running, this Kubernetes node, say it dies, it's restarted, Kubernetes will automatically, create the pod on a different machine, and it'll simply connect the resources. So your application just seamlessly works. There will be a downtime when the instance is migrated from this node to the node which is available. So this is like standard HA capabilities which are available from out of the box because of the Kubernetes platform. The other capability is what we call premium HA. In this case, it's the same thing. We'll have many instances deployed, but we'll set up an availability group across these instances, right? And in this case, it's an availability group on top of Kubernetes. So we'll have a service created for your primary applications, and we'll also have a service created for your reporting applications, your readable secondary, right? So in this case, same thing, like if a pod dies, Kubernetes is going to take care of moving that pod somewhere, and our controller is going to make one of the other nodes primary, right? And that's it. Your application simply starts working once Kubernetes has moved that other failed instance to some other place or some other node rather. Then your reporting application can use that too, right? So this kind of I mean it's obviously the same thing like what you've dealt with SQL Server, right? So now let's maybe take a quick look at how this looks. So the first thing I'm going to do is so I mean there's a different cluster. So what I will do is maybe I will just delete uh, one of the SQL instances, right? So this is a command in Kubernetes. I mean I have aliases set up, so it's actually kubectl delete pod, right? So I deleted the Kubernetes, I mean the pod from the Kubernetes cluster. So as you can see, it's immediately started recreating the pod, right? Uh, so there is a downtime now, and the application will not be able to connect the instance. But as you can see, the two containers are up and running, and this one is quickly, getting initialized again. And then the instance will be available in a few seconds, and the application connects, right? So this is like a HA capability, right, which is just out of the box provided. So now imagine you have the premium HA. In that case, what will happen is you will have a Kubernetes cluster. I'm showing actually a big data cluster SQL instance here, and there is an availability group which is created by default in the HA configuration, and it has 3 replicas, right? So you see the primary here and the 2 secondaries. So now if I connect to the primary, it's gonna say it's okay, master 0, right? Um, so now let's come here. Yeah, so that thing is running. So let me go ahead and switch the context to that cluster, right? So what I'm going to do now is delete that one SQL instance, right? So that means it's not available now and it's getting reprovisioned. So because we have the availability group set up, it's going to transparently reconnect the SQL instance. So what I will do is click again and it should just connect. See, that timing you saw was because of SSMS trying to connect again. So now it's in master 0, and if I come and replicate here, like so, as you can see, one of the secondary is not yet available. That's because I just deleted it. But so this is like a very quick translation, right? This is like similar AG capabilities, and by now it should be up and running. Yeah, it's taking like takes about a minute or so. So while that's running on some other node, I mean pod has been picked up as primary, and this one is proceeding. So this is like quick, tour on how the HA capability will look, right? Either you leverage the Kubernetes HA or you get the what we call premium HA using availability groups. Okay, so that was kind of like a whirlwind tour of Azure Arc data services. Uh, we kind of looked at what Azure Arc is, what is the Azure Arc data services. We looked at the experience in the portal. I also showed you how you can deploy data services from ADS, through the wizard. How you can deploy the data services and instances using like a GitOps workflow. I also showed you like how HA kind of works, and similarly when you create resources, how you can manage them. Thank you so much, and this is all I have for today. And please stop by for any questions in the booth. Thank you.